Association. Welcome to our rare November, because it's usually around conference time for us. So just to get things started, I want to see where everybody's calling from. And so you're going to be using the chat feature. Just let me know where you're at right now. Typing. And this is for those that are new to Lunch with NEMA. This is actually going to be how you're going to participate. So if you have any questions at all for Susie during the presentation, go ahead and type them in there, and I will be asking her, or Dan's also on the call today, so he will also be chiming in with some questions. Oh, wonderful. We have some new people coming in today, too. That's great. So now that you guys are familiar with the chat feature, we'll get going on with the presentation. Today's session is recorded and will be available on the NEMA website this afternoon at some point. So you just find it underneath the Lunch with NEMA page on the NEMA website. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Susie, but she could probably tell you a lot more than what I can. So she's actually helped us in NEMA. She's done a survey for us quite a few years ago. That's how we were first introduced to her. She has over 20 years of experience in museums, and she has been leading custom projects for museums as well as field groundbreaking national research for the last 10 years. You probably know her from various posts and stuff like that. She's actually spoken at the NEMA conference before, and AAM and ASLH and Aztec. If you haven't checked out her website yet, I would encourage you to check out the Data Museum. She does release some of the data that she is collecting, and there are some wonderful blog posts on that one. I've always been very interested in that type of information. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Susie. So Susie, if you want to do a little bit more of an introduction there to yourself before we get going, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Heather, and thank you all of you for joining us today. I'm looking down the chat list and seeing lots of names and museums. Some of my favorite museums in New England have called in, so it's nice to see. I miss New England. My family moved away just over a year ago, and I'm now based out of Seattle, to my still utter shock. But I'm delighted to be with you today about talking about the value of museums, learning, community, and outcomes. As all of you know, I'm a researcher who has lots and lots and lots of questions, and every time I do a research study, I come out of it with more questions, and I start tackling those questions. And there's some questions out there that, to be honest, I will never fully answer. So when I went into the last about 15 months worth of research, and which yielded some studies that I fielded, I had some big questions. First, why do some visitors consider museums a joy while others consider them a chore? What does true engagement with community really mean to individuals, and how do museums contribute to stronger communities? And then this one, which I know I will be working on for the next 20 years of my career, why do museums matter? And trying to piece that together again and again and add to some evidence that we do make a difference in our society. So what did I do to get started to figure out what's going on? I fielded 3 sets of research, broader population samples that are pretty easy to get now, which is really great. So I wanted to have that comparison against museum-goers with the broader population. The 2017 annual survey of museum-goers, where I'm looking at regular visitors to museums, people who go to museums on a regular basis. They're on an email list, they're on social media, they're connected to that museum in some way, both members and non-members. A little over half of those respondents came from art and history museums, and a little less than half from children's museums or science centers. This is pretty important because there's some really different motivations there that we'll talk about. And then AAM's Museums in America 2017 survey, which I fielded on behalf of AAM, and that will be coming out probably at the beginning of the year. All this work, I've shared a lot of it at the Data Museum. There's the website. So if this whets your appetite for more, you can go there and totally geek out with far more details. So the 3 big themes that we're going to talk about today are life stage, the idea of the do more is doing more, and museums matter. going to begin with life stage and motivations. Before we start talking about the three main life stages that we see in museums, I want to step back and take a look again at the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivations around learning. So this is going to be a quick refresher. For those who are extrinsically motivated to learn, which I'm going to say is all of us. I think everybody has extrinsic motivations for learning. But it's the idea that learning is primarily work, a means to an end to reach life goals. You know, to get that good job, to get a decent or generous salary. Within this broader population of learners, there are some who are proactive about it. They go out and seek out that learning to meet those ends. Or they may be more reactive and not seeking it out as avidly. But you know, about 95% of the population is primarily extrinsically motivated, and still the majority of museum goers. But there's a small group of people, which I would expect all of us to probably be in as well, who are intrinsically motivated to learn. Learning's a joy, pursued for its own sake. It doesn't mean that extrinsic motivations don't exist. I went to college to get a good job, but I also went to college because I really love to learn. It's just that even if those extrinsic life goals were in play, learning would still be pursued. Very proactive learners, probably about 5% of the population are primarily motivated by this, and a little bit less than a quarter of museum goers. Now, it's not a zero-sum game. There are individuals who are strongly extrinsically motivated and almost as strongly intrinsically motivated. What I'm looking at is what's the primary driver of learning? What's the stronger motivation when I say this? Okay, so looking at these three life stages, we're going to look at young adults without children, families with young children, and older adults. Now, there's going to be a lot of variation within each of these segments, but I'm looking at the general themes that I see in the data from these segments of museum goers. Starting with young adults. And this is primarily adults who are under the age of 40 and do not have children. And for all three of these life stage segments, I've developed what I call data stories to kind of tell a story about each of these segments. And you can also download them off of my website and print them up and put them up or whatever. So what you're seeing are excerpts from those data stories, where from these young adults without children who are strongly connected to one or more museums, they talk about museums as fun and relaxing places to visit. And they also talk about the value of museums as being a place of content that gives them something to talk about with their friends and also with their family. They'll talk about going to museums with their parents, and it gives them something to talk about and connect over. But they talk about friends more so. This generation is more likely to visit museums than older adults. But they're not as tightly connected. So what we see is we see some young adults who are very tightly connected with museums, and they're the ones we see in these samples. And their friends will be like, oh, museums are cool, and they'll go to museums, but they're just not as tightly connected. They're not as deep a connection with museum going and learning. For those young adults who are very tightly connected, though, they say things like this about museums. Museums provide culture, increase the quality of life in a community, spark interest and creativity, nurture education and awareness, and deepen our knowledge, which is a pretty nice thing to say about the value of museums. Young adults without children go to a wide variety of museums. They're not going to the same museum over and over nearly as much. So what we see is really low levels of membership because they're looking at it as a value proposition. Since they're not going to that museum 7 times in a year, it doesn't make financial sense for them. Families with young children. What we're looking at primarily here are families with children under the age of 10. So that infancy, toddler, preschool, elementary school age. And when they talk about the value of museums and the role of museums in their life, they talk about museums being safe places for their children to learn and play. And here we see the shift in the pronouns. They're talking about their kids instead of talking about themselves. They're visiting children's museums, science centers, zoos, aquaria. You could have guessed all of that. And it's all about their children learning and being engaged by doing. one of the things that comes out very strongly, and it's something that I used to kind of go, oh, yeah. Families can be together anywhere, so this is not necessarily a differentiating factor of museum. I've changed my mind about this. And I think now, looking at what people talk, how these parents talk about museums in terms of family time is something rather different. So these young parents talk about museums giving them family time where they can focus on each other. And when they talk about it, they say, without distractions. And when I've pushed on this, what I end up hearing is that families can't have family time at home very much anymore. There's too many distractions at home. They actually have to kind of pick up their family and forcibly move them to a place that's a very deliberate choice to have family time. And museums are distraction-free family time compared to most other things. So this has become, in my research, what I'm seeing as a differentiating factor of museums and a strong reason to visit museums to promote family connections and bonding. And we'll see this as an outcome a little bit later in this slide deck. When I ask these families, and it's primarily moms who are responding, but not totally, what's the value of museums in their life? This is a very typical comment. I love museums growing up, and I enjoy taking my children to them now. It's always a fun educational experience. It gives us time to unplug and spend time together as a family, creating memories while learning. So you see those emphasis things, family time together, creating memories, educational, fun, learning. And that's really kind of encapsulates the view of parents in museums. They are the most likely segment of museum goers to be members because it saves them money. They're the ones who are being those repeat visitors to the same museum over and over again. And when we look at broader population samples, families with young children are the most likely of any segment of the population to have visited a museum in the past year, just over half, which is actually pretty good. To think that half of families in the United States have visited a museum in the past year, at least once. So I was pretty encouraged by that. I'd like to go higher, of course, but I'm still pretty encouraged by that. But here's the thing. The relationship with museums isn't that tight. And what I'm seeing from the data is that a lot of these parents weren't really visiting museums very often before they had children. They were those friends of the young woman who was visiting museums often that we just saw. They're their friends, and going occasionally, but it wasn't a tight relationship. Now it's going for their children, but it's not a pattern of strong visitation over a lifetime. And then that's what we see with this next slide. By the time the kids reach middle school, we'll lose 2/3 of these families as regular museum goers, which is a pretty stunning drop-off. It gets harder when kids get older to get the whole family to a museum. But a third of them still do it, and they have some better outcomes because of it. But we lose 2/3 of them, and that's pretty hard to take. Now, this third life stage we're going to talk about are older adults. And for many museums, it feels like that's the bread and butter of their attendance. But there's some interesting twists here as well. When I talk to older adults, which are primarily age 60 and older, but you'll hear me talk a little bit about age 50 and older as well. Museums are enriching places to visit. They share knowledge and beauty. Those are the kinds of words we're hearing now from these older adults. It's a very different vocabulary. They sometimes visit with grandchildren, but primarily they're visiting on their own. And they're looking to art and history museums in particular for their visitation. And again, that why do they value museums? This is a typical comment. I have lots of these. Museums have inspired me to think about people, society, and man's roles, responsibilities, and opportunities in this world. They've broadened my perspective and introduced me to things I would never have seen, which leads me to grow as a person and connect to other people as a human being. They've given me an opportunity to share experiences with my children and expose them to new ideas as well. Museums make me happy. They inform, surprise, delight, and inspire. And you can see that very different language that's taking place now with this kind of respondent than what we see with the other two segments of respondents. They use the word inspire, perspective, connection, shared experiences, but a different kind of a shared experience. Interestingly, inspire is a word that older adults use a lot, whereas parents use imagination to talk about their kids. And it's like they don't mix those two words, which I find very fascinating. This segment supports museums by being members and donors, and they're doing it for themselves, but they're also thinking about and doing it for their communities and for that next generation. But here's the twist in the data. When we look at the broader population, adults over age 50 are the least likely to visit museums. It's not even close. It's like 1 out of 5. Very, very low visitation rates among older adults in museums. And it's sometimes hard to believe because we see so many older adults, especially our art and history museums. We do a really, really good job of engaging that 20% of museum-going older adults and circulating them through a wide variety of museums and connecting them with a wide variety of museums. We don't do a very good job of reaching the rest of their peers. And that could be a really good opportunity for museums in the future, not only as baby boomers age into these older years, but also with all of the new work that's coming out about cognitive health and how we can serve this audience more effectively. So backing up, why do we have parts of the population that are engaged, proactive learners while others are not? It's a big question that I'm starting to kind of bite off at, but we're going to, and you'll see where I am thus far on it, and I'm continuing to kind of work on and try to figure out. Which brings us to that next section, what I call the do more, do more. And it's that whole idea of if you need something done, you ask a busy person. This is this very similar thing. But what I've come to is that it's about capacity and people's capacity to engage and do things. And I spent a fair amount of time picking through research coming out of the Science of Generosity initiative at the University of Notre Dame. They're doing some really interesting work there, and that has strongly influenced my thinking. And when they were doing their research on why people are generous, they came up with this idea, which I turned into a very simple Maslow's hierarchy, which I hate Maslow's hierarchy, and I'll come back to that in a moment about why I hate it. But it actually is a fair representation of what they were talking about, which is the idea that for people to have the capacity to be generous, they first have to take care of themselves so they're not a burden to others. And then they take care of their family so their family's not a burden to others, or so their family can grow and thrive. And only if those things are taken care of can individuals really think about and be more proactive about being generous more broadly, which would be to their local communities, often the next thing, engaging with schools, being more proactive in giving through houses of worship and other community organizations. And then a small group of people have that generosity towards the broader world, which is often more abstract giving, where you're having faith that that money is going to help those individuals somewhere else. And as I'm reading this, light bulbs are just going off in my head like crazy. I was practically the Las Vegas Strip in my head with light bulbs going off, because I feel like it's the same thing when it comes to engagement, and not even just engagement with museums, but engagement with communities, because the broader population work that I'm doing shows strong correlations between museum going and engagement with community. So it's not that somebody's a museum goer or not, it's somebody's engaged with the broader community or broader world, and that includes museum going. So when I look at this through the lens of capacity for engagement, I see similar things, taking care of yourself, then engaging with your family and making sure that their needs are taken care of in terms of engagement and education and learning, and then engagement with the community and then broader world. This brackets indicate where I see museum goers, generally speaking, for many different reasons. And we're going to look at those segments of the population of museum goers to see why. So with young adults without children, what we see is high levels of engagement. They're taking care of themselves, they're taking care of their family or their close friends in this case, and we see stronger levels of engagement with the broader world. We see a stronger intrinsic desire to learn among this group of museum goers. But really low levels of community connection. They don't feel connected to their community. But despite the fact that they don't feel connected, they have very high interest in their community. So there's this kind of tension there or friction that they don't feel connected, but they have high levels of interest in their community and high levels of concerns about their community. So it's how do we as museums help them bridge that from interest and concern to actual connection. And in particular, they've shared with me that they want to know their neighbors. They don't feel like they know their neighbors, and they don't really know how to get there. And if you think about young adult museum goers, well-educated, they're less likely to be living in their hometowns. They may be in a new place and just struggling to kind of find themselves in that place. It's hard breaking into a new community. How can museums help young adults with that is a question that I'm thinking about now, having seen this data. Among families with young children, they are far more likely to be focused on that family band right here. Because it's thinking about what are we going to do to enrich the education and thinking of our children. That makes them very extrinsically motivated learners. It's not about learning for learning's sake. It's about learning to help their children thrive and prosper into the future. So when I look at responses from families with young children, or if I'm doing qualitative work with this group, I will often get comments that will say something kind of like, I bring my kids to the museum because it's going to help them do better in school. It's going to round out their education so they will do better in school and go off to college, and so on and so forth. And so they do draw those conclusions. Their engagement with the local community has increased with children, so they have that connection with the community, but we don't see very much connection with the broader world among this segment of museum goers. There are some in there that do certainly have that connection, but just not as much of it. Like young adults, they also want to connect more with their neighbors, and they talk about they would love to learn who their neighbors are and not feeling that connection with their neighbors. So, that strong extrinsic motivation around learning does affect their capacity for engagement of where they're focused on right now. And it makes total sense. I have 2 young children, and even though my natural resting place is in this broader world area, when my children were very young, I was back here focusing on taking care of my kids and making sure they have what they needed. So these aren't fixed categories, is what I'm trying to say, but this is where families tend to fall. And then for older adults, they have the greatest level of community connection among museum goers, but remember that they're outliers. High levels of engagement with the broader world, intrinsically motivated learners, these museum goers, but again, they're outliers. Now, I mentioned that I hate Maslow's hierarchy, even though I think, looking at clinically, it's a good assessment of where the population falls, or the biggest segment of the population is going to fall in this self category, taking care of themselves, and family. That's going to be a really large segment of the population overall, and then smaller segments going higher and higher. Clinically, it's an accurate representation. They also build on one another. What I hate about Maslow's hierarchy is the implication that the people who are up here are better than the people who are down here. And that is not something that I want to suggest I am saying at all. There's too many external forces coming into play that affect where somebody's capacity to engage with the world is at that one moment. And So we're going to talk about those disengaged individuals and what we're seeing from the broader population samples. Because museum goers have the capacity to engage with their communities in the broader world. That capacity tends to come with higher levels of educational attainment. They're more likely to have grown up in a college-educated household, which also has a huge effect on that. And then that higher education also affecting income levels. Not everyone does have that capacity. And I've come to the point that this is an issue of privilege and class, to the point where my radical thinking is that museums actually perpetuate, are part of that system that perpetuates income inequality. We're helping the rich get richer by what we're doing in terms of our engagement with museum goers, setting aside field trips, but regular museum goers coming in every day. So when we look at the disengaged, the individuals who are not that engaged with their community, who are not that engaged with museums or other forms of informal learning, what we see are lower levels of civic engagement, lower levels of concerns about the community, lower levels of interest in their community, and lower levels of cultural participation. Generally, lower educational attainment, but not always. My estimate is that this is 2/3 of the population, which is a huge number. And if you really want to see how I came up with 2/3, one of the posts on the Data Museum actually lays out all of my thinking and all of my math. It's kind of stomach churning to think that 2/3 of the population don't feel connected. And there are ramifications of that we're seeing play out in our communities across the country. And it's that same 2/3 of the population that museums are effectively not serving. Those 2/3 of the population, it's not that they don't care about others. It's not that they're never generous, they're never paying attention. It's not that they never visit museums. Not an assessment of character. I want to make that very clear. But it's a recognition that their capacity to engage has been limited by external forces, which are many. And I list 6 here: economic insecurity, family medical or caregiving needs, childhood upbringing, social network, and what peers are doing, systemic racism, and as well as those others are going to come into play as well. Those are the 5 big ones. All of those influence whether somebody becomes a museum goer, whether they're proactive about their learning, whether they're engaged with their community, and whether they're reaping the benefits of all of those things. I also want to note, and this is where research is limited, the measures that I'm looking at are not comprehensive. I'm not capturing informal interactions, neighborhood dynamics, or aspirations. And it's hard to capture those. I'm looking at external sources as well. I'm pulling in a lot of external sources to help me think through what I'm seeing in my data. So then the question becomes, how do we engage the disengaged within their existing capacities? How can we help grow their capacities, and why should they care? And it boils down to better outcomes. Just very pragmatically, those that engage have better life outcomes. And this is true even when we control for educational attainment. When we look at adults with college degrees that are disengaged in their community, they have different outcomes than those who are engaged with their community or are engaged with also things like museums. Same thing is true for those without college degrees. Those who are engaged have better outcomes than those who are not engaged, even when we control for that education. And what are those outcomes? They're pretty significant. Education and economic. What we see among those who are engaged with their communities and those who are doing things like going to museums is we do see overall that higher educational attainment, but even when we control for that, so we're only comparing those with similar educations, those who engage with their communities, do things like go to museums, are more likely to be employed full-time. They are also more likely to have a higher income. And it's not a small difference either. When it comes to health and wellness, people who engage with their communities and with culture, statistically speaking, have longer, healthier lives. And there's a lot of great research coming out of the UK in particular that's informing this, but there's also some work coming out of the University of Pennsylvania about work in New York City that's informing this. And those sources I do have at the back of this deck. And then when it comes to family, stronger family connections, the easiest way to track this is by marriage rates. Individuals who are engaged with their community and do things like go to museums are more likely to be married. Those are some pretty strong outcomes that matter.
Susie?
Yes.
I do have a question that came in. Susan asked, how do you know which is cause and which is effect? Engagement can be a confounding factor.
Right, and that's where a lot of the external studies that I'm looking at are thinking about that as well. And the work that's coming out of the UK, there's a meta-study that came out of the UK covering health and wellness across socio-demographic factors, and showing enough conclusive evidence from the probably thousands of studies that they looked at that especially that culture factor is making a difference when everything else is controlled for. So if you think about it, the way I'm thinking about it is, because it's a great question, it's a hard one to answer, is that families that proactively learn, perpetuate, and pass down that learning generally, or that mindset around learning, and it's that mindset that makes the difference in terms of reaching those life outcomes. So I don't have in my data the ability to say this is what's causing it, but I'm looking at enough external studies from academia that suggests that this is part of what helps some families do better than others.
Okay. I also have another question now that we're talking right now. Peter asked, how is their community defined? Does it include engaging communities that are not theirs, or is that cultural tourism?
I'm asking them about their community where they live.
Okay.
And it's a great question because I'm actually looking at the question. In my 2018 annual survey that will be launching in January, I'm looking at that idea of half of my sample will end up getting this set of questions about sense of place and what does it mean in terms of tourism, because I think that's easy for people to answer. But then the follow-up question is, okay, now how do the museums in your community contribute to your sense of place, or do they not do it at all, kind of question, which I think will be harder for them to answer. And I'm particularly interested in actually more interested in that answer than the tourism one, because I think the tourism one, they'll know, it'll be easier to predict what's going to happen. I just want to know what they say about their own communities and that sense of place and how museums contribute to that. So that'll be an interesting line of inquiry in that survey. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of that.
Should be interesting. So Kathleen, I think we're going to wait to your question till the end, just to let you know why I'm not asking it right now.
Okay.
Okay, so Susie, I will let you continue.
Okay. So given that the vast majority of the population is primarily motivated by extrinsic reasons for learning, that turns around how we talk about our museums and what we're doing to think about these extrinsic needs and present a value proposition to them that's based on those extrinsic needs. And if you have read in the Data Museum, you see at one point I talk about a hissy fit basically I threw at an unnamed science center that had these very expensive, lovely banners up on advertising, I think it was summer camp or something like that. And they used all these words that I'm like, these are the worst banners ever, because it's all about intrinsic motivations of learning, and it's just going to wash right over most people, because it wasn't the kind of language that I see in my data that extrinsically motivated parents who go to museums actually use to think about the value of museums in their life. So really, kind of, as we think about this, it matters in terms of how are we actually presenting ourselves to the broader population as fun and engaging places if we're not using the right language that they're using and addressing those very explicit extrinsic needs that they have. And being a little bit more, I guess, practical about that. Because then, if we can broaden our attendance and visitation and address those needs, that gives us the opportunity to extend our impact in more meaningful ways and really help grow their capacities to engage. And that's where the true value of museums comes through. So switching to this next section about why museums matter. It was a question that I asked in my sampling of basically what's been the role or value of museums in your life. Just step back and go, has there been any value to museums in your life? If so, what has it been? If not, why don't you think so? Well, of course, these are museum-goers. They overwhelmingly said, yes, of course there's been value to museums in my life. And it's really interesting to pick apart what they actually said in this open-ended question. I spent a long time coding these responses. And they came into two different categories: extrinsic motivations and outcomes. Those who were extrinsically motivated tended to talk about the value of museums rooted in external outcomes. Learning as a means to an end, improving life outcomes, family bonding. And again, this is the majority of the population, but also the majority of museum goers. Those who were intrinsically motivated talked about the value of museums in ways that were rooted in effective engagement with the content and how those content-based engagements affected their interactions with the world. And I saw this in two different questions that I asked in the survey, but really came out in both of them, but more so in this one. And again, this is a small sliver of the population and still less than a quarter of museum goers. Those extrinsic benefits, what I saw when I coded and finished up the coding is around career influence, learning, shared family experiences and bonding, and health and wellness. I'm not going to read all these quotes. I'll give you all a few moments to read them yourself. But here's the first one. It kind of talks about the career influence of a museum experience. And if I flip too fast, let me know. The next one, it talks about both shared family experiences and learning. Family bonding. There was another one that I decided was too personal to put onto a slide based on what I read. That I can share the idea of. It was a woman who wrote in and said that she valued this particular museum, and this one that she was responding to, because she was the birth mother of a child that she was adopted by another family, and that's where once a year they always had their annual meeting was at that museum, and so she got to see her son at this museum once a year, and every year he's a little bit bigger and interacted with the same exhibits but a little bit differently. And it's just, I'm sitting there just crying over this lovely, lovely family bonding experience that was happening at this museum. So I think sometimes we forget how important museums are for family bonding. And I used to dismiss it, and now I'm going, whoa, wait a second, this is really important. And I have others as well, but that one was particularly memorable. Health and wellness. I do tend to see this more from older respondents, but not always. And then for the intrinsic benefits of museums, those come into three different categories. First up, kind of the idea of the conception of the world coming via museum experiences. And what I love about this one is that the contextual knowledge that you see that we have is when we walk into, let's say, an art museum. a little kid doesn't have it, but they made up their own. And I think that's one reason why art museums seem not age appropriate for families with young children, yet young children do really, really well in art museums. But I think parents often underestimate what the kid is doing with when looking at art and history as well. This one's about greater understanding of others. And then thinking about the human condition and tolerance. And I get that phrase a lot, that human condition, that comes up often among museum goers when they share with me their value of museums, understanding the human condition. I would never use that in marketing materials, however. But it's a great outcome for us to be a part of. And the thing is, this is a both-and situation, not an either-or situation. Both extrinsic and intrinsic benefits of museums are important. That all of these outcomes matter, and I don't want to say that one group of them is more important than the other. And they're not mutually exclusive. All of those extrinsic outcomes are things that I value as a parent when I take my children to museums just as much as any other parent. I just layer on more because I'm also a very intrinsically motivated individual. So, but the individuals that seem to benefit the most are the ones who do combine this extrinsic and intrinsic. And we have an example of that in the next quote. So our challenge is, how do we gather evidence of outcomes we already contribute to and why they matter when that comes to education, economic prospects, health and wellness, and family memories and bonding. Some of these are easier to track than others, but doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to do it for all of them. How do we focus efforts on maximizing those outcomes? How do we take our work to those who need it, and all to expand the capacity among the broader population, which helps individuals and families? Because it's a social justice issue. We have to do better at this. The field trips that we host are a great step, but it's not enough. How do we extend the benefits of museums to those not receiving them and aim to improve the life outcomes of 2/3 of the population? And through this, cultivate greater compassion, understanding, and helping to benefit communities and society. And I want to leave you with this one quote, which I love so much, because I think it really represents the goals that we should have. This one individual wrote in, "I'm very fortunate throughout my childhood. We traveled extensively, and each trip was a combination of recreation and education. This was then my MO with my own daughter. These trips and visits bring historical perspective to the world around us and the places we live. They offer a point of view that allows us deeper relationships with our neighbors, particularly those who may not have our same ethnographic characteristics. They help us expand our own views and generate a natural curiosity, ultimately allowing us to create deeper and stronger relationships with those we meet. Ultimately, I believe museums, travel, and experiencing things outside our own small microcosms make us better people, period." So, museums matter. And to thank you for sticking with me for the past 40-some-odd minutes, I'm going to put my thank you into the words of those who think about museums, which are our museum goers, and what they said to you through the survey, which is thank you for everything you do that feeds people's souls. Thanks for making this view of the world possible. Thank you for the opportunities for all of us. And thank you for what you do to enrich the minds of the children who are able to visit. And as they said, thank you for all you do. So I know there's a couple of questions here, and I also want to make sure that you have information on how to get more details as well. Okay, there's a question here. If all types of museums can improve this type of outreach and engagement, would museums with more traditional, less diverse artwork be added to disadvantage versus places like children's museums? That's a great question. The way I think of it is I think of children's museums and science centers and zoos and aquariums as kind of the entry museums. When I look at parents with young children, that's who didn't go to museums much before they had children, but now that they're parents, they go to the museum. That's where they're going. The problem I'm seeing is that they don't end up going to the next level of museums, which would be the history museums, the art museums, so museums that they feel like they're harder to visit, even though that may not necessarily be true. But they feel more intimidating as a parent because they don't think they're as age appropriate. When I look at outcomes from these two different kinds of museums, I see very different things. Science centers and children's museums do a pretty good job at meeting the needs of those extrinsic motivations. So that family time, notwithstanding parents standing at children's museums on their phones, still there's family time still going on there. The feeling that their kids are learning something and the learning outcomes, the direct learning outcomes from those experiences, those matter. The more intrinsic outcomes that I see, which is about tolerance and understanding and empathy and caring and the human condition, the more complicated contextualized outcomes come from the history and art museums. So they're playing different roles. What I would like to see is how do we present history and art in ways that are more accessible to extrinsically motivated individuals, including families, but not just families. So it feels more accessible. It feels more useful, while also still providing that deeper contextualization in ways that make them matter even more so today than ever. And that's not an easy solution. I know that. But that's the way I've been thinking about it. Does that help, Kathleen? And while you're responding, I'm going to look down at the next question. Okay, I'm looking at Keith's question about interactive engagement, look, learn, the delivery mechanism for context to the audience is equally important as the content. Yes, very much so, Keith. I think you've nailed it. If we think about how we deliver it while still delivering the goods, the deeper context. The woman who founded American Girl Dolls once had a comment, which I think is very appropriate, where she said, what I'm doing is making or providing chocolate cake with vitamins. We got to present that chocolate cake on the terms of how the visitor wants it or the potential visitor wants it. They want that chocolate cake, or if you don't like chocolate like I do, that toffee blondie or whatever it is. But we're still going to be packing it in with some vitamins in there too, with the aim for those larger outcomes as well. So yes, you're absolutely right.
So Kathleen did say that it helps to some degree, but it makes me think more on the relevance of our art.
Yeah, and I think the biggest challenge for art museums is that age appropriateness barrier. That, and I'll with my peers, I'm talking to other parents at the schools that my kids go to. I have a 6-year-old and a daughter who would say she's 3 and 11/12. And they can't believe that I take my kids to art museums, and that I've always taken my kids to art museums. And they talk about how they don't grasp the art. I'm like, why do you think they should? Why do you think they should grasp the art? I don't care if they grasp the art. I just care that they are in this interesting environment. They're looking at interesting things, and who knows what they're getting out of it? Doesn't really matter. They're there, and then I do see outcomes on it. But it's that age appropriateness barrier is just really tough for families. So how do we get past that? Which that would make a really good line of inquiry at some point in qualitative work. and to actually send parents to art museums who would say, I'd never, and see what happens. That might be a really good experiment. Or how do you take art to children's museums and science centers so that they're getting it there and maybe providing a gateway? Okay. Dan, how does the current wave of anti-intellectualism in the country affect our ability to engage audiences? Oh, yeah. So I'm not sure that anti-intellectualism is actually any worse than before. I think it's just more vocal right now. I am running some samples right now trying to understand if there's been any shifts in how much people trust museums. One thing I will say that I see in this latest data set is information overload. And I have a few respondents who will say things like what they value about museums is that it's there is kind of that trusted expert who will sort through everything so I don't have to. The realization that there's so much information out there that if I want to go learn about gophers, yeah, sure, I could go to Wikipedia. But if I really want to learn about gophers, how much am I going to really trust Wikipedia? I need to go figure it out, something deeper. And maybe then they'll go to the gopher exhibit at the Natural History Museum. And they're going to trust the Natural History Museum more than what they're trying to figure out. And it's kind of intimidating to figure out on their own. And I don't know why I just came up with the example of gophers. So I think there's a group of the population that really values the sorting through of information on their behalf on things that they are interested in but are not life critical to them. So they're valuing curators who sort through information on gophers or ancient Egypt or whatever, because they don't have to do that. And they don't have to figure that out for their kid, or with their kid's school project or whatever. But I think that segment of the population that is very anti-intellectualism is much more vocal. And they're not coming to museums, which doesn't mean we can just write them off. We can't. But I think we need to watch that area in between where if you think of anti-intellectualism at one extreme and museum goers who are valuing the work of curators at the other extreme, all those individuals in the middle, how do we reach them effectively when that they're hearing a lot from that anti-intellectualism extreme in the media? And I think that's the more troubling area that I'm more concerned about.
So Susan she put the question out there, can museums partner with each other to help families graduate from one type of museums to another?
I would love that. I think that's a great idea. So one of the things I have in the 2018 survey, which is going to be going out in the field in January, and there's information in my slide deck on how your museum can participate. All the parents that are receiving the survey, I'm splitting the sample between parents and non-parents because I have some very specific line of questioning that I really want to get to with parents. I'm asking them if they are going to museums more or less than before they had children, and then I'm asking them by museum type. So they're going to actually share with me whether they're going to art museums more or less or about the same, or there's a category of didn't visit then, still don't visit. That's going to allow me to kind of pick apart and look more with much more nuance at that the pattern of museum going by museum type and suggest those pathways of what if my hypothesis is that I'm going to see a lot of children's museums and science centers, but I'm not going to see the graduation to art and history as much as we would like. So that's going to suggest that pathway, but the data is going to support it better than my hypothesis where I say that. And that might be a great way for children's museums and science centers to complement what they do so well, which is address those extrinsic motivations for learning by pulling in some of those vitamins. and then also help those art and history museums pull in those families and reach them as well more effectively. Do you take into account misconstrued changes? Okay, I'm reading Heather Rockwood's question about.
That's a pretty good one.
Okay, I'm going to, and
we're at the 5-minute marker, just to let you know.
Okay. So I'll answer this question, and then I'll show you how to find more information. Okay, so I do have some political data. I will say that. I do have some political data. The biggest cache of political data is the one that's coming out via AAM, likely after the new year. And so I have a sense of where people fall along the political spectrum and how it compares with their motivations. I suspect, based on that information, that people on the far right are not participating in my survey of museum goers because they're not that deeply connected to museums in general, which doesn't mean they're not going to revolutionary history museums or certain museums that are within their interests, and they may even be very vocal visitors when they're there. I've heard about what's going on at Colonial Williamsburg and some of the interpretive challenges that they've been facing. So when I talk about museum goers, I'm largely talking about conservatives and liberals and moderates who are to the left of the Tea Party and also that anti-intellectualism group, by and large, not totally, but by and large. However, in the broader population work, I do have those more conservative idealists that do pop up into my surveys. And most of them have not been to a museum in the past year, most of them. I would hypothesize that they probably didn't visit museums very much as a child either, but that's probably not going to be totally true. The question then would be, those segments of the population, it would be interesting. I don't have enough of them to see, but it would be interesting to see how connected they feel to their local community. And it would be only guesswork to hypothesize about that. That would be really interesting. Could museums reach them? What would that? How would it matter? I don't know. But I don't see them very much in my Museum-Goers survey. I see them in the broader population samples, so certainly.
That could be like a massive discussion on that too.
Oh my gosh! And and my slide deck. I have to be honest with everybody. It scares me. I'm very uncomfortable with some of the things I've shared in this slide deck, in terms of I hate that Maslow's hierarchy. I hate it so much. Yet it's the most accurate way I have of presenting that little bit of data. And I'm actually sharing other versions of it that I can at least write around on the data museum, so you can say, well, this is why I'm doing it this way, even if I don't like this particular graphic. But every other graphic I came up with is more misleading. And I'm like, oh, this is really horrible. And I'm also really uncomfortable, with some of the class discussions, because I come from a place of privilege. And there are head-slapping moments I've had with my data, and I've tried to be very transparent about it. So if you go back and look at the data museum, you will see, my head-slapping moment. Oh my gosh, having an intrinsic motivation comes from a place of privilege because it's expensive to support an intrinsic motivation. Yeah. But if I don't tackle this and I don't at least try, even if I say something wrong at some point, not because I want to say something wrong, because it comes out the wrong way, it's worse to not try than to at least be uncomfortable and try anyway. So that's why I'm putting it out there, as uncomfortable as I am coming from my place of privilege. So acknowledging that place of privilege that I have. So you can find more information on my website. If you go to my website, on the Data Museum is where I've released a ton of more information around this. On the curated bookshelf, I review external sources, including a lot of those external sources around health and wellness and the outcomes of culture and engagement around that issue. I have a newsletter you can sign up for. And if you go to the page called Resources, you can find printable reports from this data. So if you don't like to look at a blog version, you'd rather just print out a PDF, go there. You'll get that they're all there too. And also my infographic data stories about the segments of Museum-Goers are there that you can download. Here's a list of a lot of the external sources that have fed into this work. And so some of them are reviewed on the curated bookshelf, but not all of them. So you can go crazy with that if you really want to. And if you're interested in participating in the 2018 annual survey, which you heard me start to talk about, and some of the lines of inquiry that I've already got programmed into that, this is the enrollment period. And what it does is that's where I really push the thinking further to that next step through an overall sample. Individual museums also receive their custom results, benchmark data that they can use from year over year, and a couple custom questions. So the enrollment period's right now, and it's $1,000 per museum to enroll. So all that information is there. And Janice, I will email you. Oh, I can answer Janice's really quickly. I agree that it's not presented as a better than, Maslow's not presented as a better than thing. I'm just afraid that people will construe it that way because of the relative placement. So that's why I'm not really a big fan of the visualization. So anything else, Heather?
No, I mean, Heather had a follow-up, but it was just a good point on that one about misconstruing the context.
Yeah, that's true.
But we are at our 1 o'clock hour, so, and I know you have a flight to catch.
I do. So I do want anyone who has further questions to feel free to email me because I love thinking about this stuff, and when y'all push me on it, that makes me think harder and better for my next going out into the field. So don't hesitate.
Okay. Wow, lots of thank yous on that one, and I want to thank you personally from NEMA for presenting on this information that you've been collecting and sharing it with us. And I also want to mention that we'll be starting Lunch with NEMA back up again in January. So if you have any ideas or if you would actually like to present, just give the NEMA office a call. We'd be happy to talk to you. And again, just a reminder that the webinar was recorded, so we would be it should be up this afternoon on the Lunch with NEMA site. So Susie, thank you so much, and there's Susie's information. You can also contact me directly at NEMA, and I could share her email address. But again, her website does have quite a bit of useful information on that. And so thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you, Susie, and have a great holiday.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.